What are all the awards back on your wall there?
Oh, I honestly didn't know what to do with them, so I just stuck them on the wall.
Well, you must be
You know,
doing
they're behind me because I don't pay much attention to them.
I'm sitting in the breakfast room at the Hotel McPherson. That's my environment right now.
Hi, everyone. It's good to see you all.
Hello.
Good morning.
Morning. Hello, everyone. It's good to see you all coming in. Before we get started, Matt in the Kansas Water office, I just wanted to check in and see if everything is good on your end before we get started here in a few minutes.
Everything is good here right now.
Great, thank you. We'll wait a few more minutes. There's a few more people coming on. All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started at least. I'm going to call the meeting to order of the Kansas Water Authority. I'm going to start off by taking roll. So if you could be prepared to unmute your mic, we'll start off with that. So Mike Armstrong.
Here.
Hi, Mike. John Bailey.
Present.
Morning, John. Lynn Goosen. I don't think I've seen Lynn on here yet, but is he here? Okay. Randy Hazlett.
Here.
Hi, Randy.
How are you doing?
Good. Thank you. Jeremiah Hobbs.
Here.
Hi, Jeremiah.
Good morning.
Gary Jansen. Is Gary here yet? Okay. Pete Lockey.
I'm here. Hello, gang.
Hi, Pete. Senator McGinn.
Here.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Afternoon-ish. Alan Roth.
Here.
Hi, Alan. Alan Sotart.
Here.
Hi, Alan.
Hello.
Jean Steiner.
Here.
Hi, Jean. And David Stroberg.
Here.
Hello, David.
Good
All right,
morning,
so
Dawn.
good morning. I'm going to go through the ex officios. Let's see, is Ryan Hoffling here? I don't see him on here. Earl Lewis. Jay Colbus.
Hello.
Hi, Jay. Susan Metzger. Chris Kennedy. Sarah Bear.
Here.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Leo Henning.
Hey, Dawn, it's Tom Stiles for Leo.
Hi, Tom. How are you?
Good.
Okay. Tom's on here. Steve Frost.
Yes, here.
Hi, Steve.
Hi, Dawn.
Is Mike Beam here? I don't think so.
He's on a call, but he will be here shortly. This is
Okay,
Josh.
thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Josh. Kayla Savage. And Connie Owen.
I'm here.
Hi, Connie.
Good morning or afternoon, in the middle.
It's in the middle, isn't it? Yeah, it's a little of both. All right. Well, thank you all for taking the time today to join us for this meeting as we continue to work on the Kansas Water Plan implementation. So I'd like to recognize that, this has been a fast pace and that it's also an exciting time. So a lot of great work happening. This is going to require and has required that we change the way we think about water. The process is encouraging us to think agency agnostic about projects and programs as well. This has been a year of transition and, as Julie likes to call it, evolution. I love that word, Julie. But there are also many opportunities for feedback and comment, and today is one of those opportunities for feedback from the Kansas Water Authority. Before I kick this over to Julie with Burns and McDonald, I would like to recognize and applaud the efforts of our agency personnel on the enormous amount of work they have put forward for our review and input, on top of their already demanding workloads. So thank you for all that you have given to this important work to date. As we get started, I want to remind the members of the Kansas Water Authority and those that are on the Zoom portion of the call that the intent of this exercise today is to only have voting members participate in the survey. So ex officios should not answer the questions, but we do welcome your verbal participation. And with that, I would like to welcome Julie Lorenz with Burns and McDonald back to the Kansas Water Authority.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dawn. It's great to be with everyone today. Amy will be running the presentation for us. And I'd like to start by saying, first of all, and we'll do a quick preview of where we stand in terms of RSVPs. And then I appreciate the opportunity to preview material. Every time we've gotten together to preview material, it's only resulted in things in materials getting better, clearer. So everything that you're going to see today is still very much in draft form, but man, we've got to move quickly because next slide, please. You're going to see we're out and about starting next Tuesday in Colby. So these are the current RSVP levels. You can see a really strong participation out in Dodge. That's our number one, you'll recall, in terms of the two metro areas, Wichita and Kansas City. Given the large response we had last time, we added 2 meetings in the metro areas. So you can see the Wichita and Newton, as well as the Leavenworth and Topeka. Sizes are certainly more manageable now. For a total, currently of a little over 400 folks have registered. We also saw last time attendance increase as we went around the state. So I'm hopeful, we want to see those numbers continue to grow. Also, there's the 250 people who have RSVP'd already to say that they want to participate in the on-demand meeting. So that's not a webinar. You could dial in at 5 a.m. on Thursday morning, or if you're having a hard time sleeping on Friday morning, you could dial in at 3 a.m. A survey will be attached or part of that on-demand meeting, so people will be able to provide their thoughts. But I think it's a good step forward for engagement in Kansas to offer an on-demand opportunity. So we really want to include as many people as possible. So there are the 2 options, in person and also the on-demand. And if you've got your friends or neighbors, colleagues, please encourage them to attend or to log in. And this is a quick view. Thank you, Maggie, of pulling these stats together for us so that we can see the demographics of who we anticipate. Local government at 28%, conservation at 23%, and then grain producers at 12%, and state government at 9%. So that's a quick view of the RSVPs we have as of this morning. So, and this is a quick show. The darker the color, the larger the number of attendees. So you can get a distribution of where we will be seeing people attend from. All right, and with that, what we're going to do, it's a 2-part conversation today. I will be keeping an eye on time, so we'll wrap up promptly by 1:30. This is the presentation. You would have received that yesterday as a PDF along with the accompanying handouts. We'll go through the presentation first, then I'll ask for comments and questions. And then we will move into the criteria weighting conversation, or the bracketology. So with that, we'll get started. Thank you. All right, so you'll recall from round 1, more than 1,000 Kansans have provided input so far, including more than 600 at local consult. Then we were at the KDHE Water Conference, and then we had a very successful ag webinar with more than 200 folks participating. When you add up all the things that we heard, and we had a great amount of input, people said, yes, move forward, implement a program that serves all Kansans, recognizing that we all have one water problem or another. They just vary across the state. Provide proactive strategies. So again, you'll see some movement within the way we're organized so that we can be more proactive. Long-term funding, so moving away from annual appropriations into something that would look more like a 10-year transportation program. And then very much programs and services and investments that are informed by local input. Okay, so those are the key takeaways. Next slide. I think this is a graphic that really demonstrates we need sort of less of the top and more of the bottom, and how we're going to build toward what Kansans want. So a good analogy is at the top, we have lots of individual programs, so to speak, and water crisis is the shark that's chasing us. That's one example. Or we've got little communities that are working hard to take action, but again, they're kind of off on their own in some cases. And so what we really want to try to do is shift the dynamic so that we have more integrated programs. That's one way of looking at the collaboration between the programs. Less about the 8 specific agencies and more alignment across addressing specific problems. We're going to talk more about that. And also better collaboration between individual communities, their regions, their counties, and state government, such that we're all turning around and we're not reacting to crisis, but there will be much more proactive and intentional across a longer time span. And so that's really the goal of where we're trying to move over time. As Dawn said, it's an exhilarating time, lots to think about. Also, it's a 10-year view. Like, this isn't the decisions we make in 2024 could be, updated in 25 and in 26 and 28, because we're taking a longer term view now, and we want to be more adaptive and more nimble. Okay, next slide. So you'll recall the water plan is fantastic, and we are primarily focused on the big 3 problems of aquifers, reservoirs, and water quality, but certainly I've heard, and don't want to diminish at all, the importance of education and awareness and building that. That sort of undergirds all of our programs, and increasing our adaptability or reducing our vulnerability to extreme events. Next slide. And Kansans certainly agreed with those as the primary problems. Today, both today and as we go into local consult, we'll be looking for input in the 3 areas of criteria, reasonability, and revenues. And the first step is criteria. So next slide. And the reason that we're working towards shared criteria is that it's really hard when you're investing across a program, that a statewide program, and you're trying to address different problems with different programs. You want to be able to connect the investments and the outcomes in a way such that if you had to do a trade-off between investments, you could begin to understand what Kansans most value and how you can apply those values to the decisions, because we're always going to have constrained resources. And as resources, and Senator McGinn's on the phone, there are years where the state has more money and less money. And so there are times when programs will need to scale up or down, and we need to have consistent criteria so that we can make ongoing decisions in a systematic way that is responsive to what stakeholders have told us over time. So the next slide, please. So you'll recall we sent out and some of this is, I realize some of this we covered when we were together in Wichita, but we sent out a list of examples of potential shared criteria, and those are shown here on the slide. I want to emphasize, the point isn't that any of these are going to be removed or aren't important. But the point is, if you had to make a decision between A and B, sometimes you really do have to pick, like, what's the thing that's going to be the deciding factor if all else is equal? And that's the point of the conversation that we're going to have today. All of these are helpful. I also want to point out that, we're going to pay our bills, the funding obligations, like right off the top. We're going to make sure that gets taken care of. We're going to make sure that programs are serving the guiding principles or the big problem areas. We're going to make sure we're compliant with federal and state requirements. So we don't need to prioritize those as criteria. Those are sort of like baseline baked into the delivery of programs. So that's why you're not seeing those as criteria to select from. Next slide. So again, we're going to have tough decisions because we're never going to have enough money. So if you had a strategy A, B, and C, and they all cost $2 million, and they were all going to help a different kind of problem, but you only had $2 million to spend. How would you choose between these? And this is when you go back and take a look at that criteria as sort of like the factor that really helps you make that decision, sort of the tipping point. So next slide. Another way to look at that is if you had 3 strategies, for example, all would improve water quality, you would look at that at criteria to help you decide between those. So what we're trying to do is step away from, let's look at each individual project each time, and instead say, let's have a holistic framework that will help us make decisions on a consistent basis. One that we are responsive to Kansans and that we can explain to people how we arrived at that criteria and thus our decisions. Next slide. And we talked about this at the Water Authority meeting. So let's pick cost effectiveness as, for example, the shared criteria that goes across all programs. That criteria could be weighted in different proportions you see under program A and B, depending on what the purpose of the program is. And then in some programs for C and D, for example, not only weighted at different proportions, but you would have other criteria that are built into those programs. The point here is it's a unifying framework, but it's not applied in exactly the same way because programs need to be tailored for the outcomes that they're intended to accomplish. So it's a way to stitch together various agencies, various investments, and various programs, but still allow and encourage the expertise of the agencies to make those decisions on individual programmatic or project selections. Okay, next slide. So this is the exercise we're going to go through at the end, but you see here now we've got our bracket, and we will do so a pairwise comparison, for example, between human health and economic impact. And we will do an online poll, and we'll see which one we'll both discuss the value of both of those. And then we'll move to, next slide, please, to the one that emerges, which in this case is economic impact as by way of example. And we'll continue to play that out until we get to the final 4. We're going to, this is super helpful to the consultant team to hear the conversation, and we can also start to gauge like how much time we might allow in each of the breakout groups, because today is a practice and time matters. You also have a handout that helped give you a flavor of how the metrics or how we might measure some of this criteria. And so in addition to the explainers there, because I think I've covered these, also there's a chance for you to write in criteria, and you'll be asked to explain like, okay, so what would you, if you write in, like, what does that mean to you? In the breakout groups, folks will be allowed to suggest, but if someone was to say bananas and nobody else in the group thinks bananas makes any sense as a criterion, that probably wouldn't make it into the bracket for that breakout group. Okay, next slide. The second portion of the breakout sessions that we'll have really are around these reasonability or reasonable standards. And what this helps us do is both talk about potential revenue increases and policy changes. So next slide. So you might recall when we were out the first time, we talked about the problems that we're trying to address. And the first is around the aquifer situation and the usable or remaining life. And we know that Kansans are faced in some cases with maybe 25 years of remaining life or 50 years of remaining life in their aquifers. And we'll get to a map later, which really helps us hone in on some of these areas of concern. But one of the things we want to talk about, next slide, are the strategies that could address those problems. And so you might remember we talked about we need to conserve water for future generations. And so we said, all right, so here are some strategies in local consult. We said, hey, we could have more, we could work toward more efficiency through tech upgrades and reuse systems. We could do large scale property or water rights acquisition, and we could monitor water conditions. What we heard was like, no, don't go buy everybody's water rights. That's not helpful to our economies, and it's not really the answer that Kansans would support. So now, as we're going out to local consult, we will be talking about grants to vulnerable communities for targeted water rights purchase. Okay, so that we're going to show our work right from, we talked about this problem. Here are the strategies based on your input that we might envision in additional implementation steps. Next slide. We talked about our reservoirs and how they're filling up with sediment and it's starting to exceed their estimated usable life. Next slide. Thus, we will be talking about these challenges that we need more water storage. So we have increased resiliency. We need to secure municipal water sources. The investment strategies that we'll be talking about at local council are to increase storage capacity through sedimentation reduction, protect watersheds by preventing sediment from reaching in the initial stages, and then to evaluate first, and then go through the process to determine if it would be possible and practical to implement regionalized water project to connect water systems to other regions or to multiple sources. So those are the kinds of things we'll be taking out to discuss in round 2. Next slide. And we'll reference the Caney example, which is a good example of both not having a backup plan and also a bunch of leaky pipes. And we know that about 100 communities are vulnerable to an event that would be similar to Caney. And then we talked about our water quality challenges, where we know that many of our lakes and reservoirs, are, if we want to move on to the next slide, I think we've got the next graphic too. We know many of our water bodies are impaired compared to their intended use. So maybe you could fish, but you couldn't swim. And, I think if you look in this, maybe we have a handful of counties maybe that don't have impaired water issues. And we certainly know some parts of the state are in worse condition than others. Next slide. And so we're going to talk about strategies that could help address our water quality problems. And I would be quick to add, we're not only going to talk about strategies, but we're going to talk about the money part of that. So we would be looking at infrastructure grants, to improve water and sewer systems, protecting watersheds from pollution and stormwater, runoff, and addressing nitrates in drinking water. Okay, now next slide. So you'll recall when we went out for round 1, we said, look, when you sort of look across our investments, stand pat, pretty much what we're doing now, and we outlined various outcomes at $60 million. We said we could move the needle, and if we move the needle across all of our problem areas, we could achieve these sorts of outcomes for about 120, and at the game changer, about 360. And this is average annual. So if we were to take what we all thought were great scenarios under the game changer of 3.6 billion over 10 years, we all thought those are probably dollars we can't afford. So the agencies have gone back and taken a hard look at what did Kansans say they really most wanted in terms of outcomes, and also took a look at them, what would that translate into dollars? So we are bringing to you today a new scenario. You can call it Local Consult 2 scenario. It's only a scenario, okay? It's not the recommendation yet. We're not there yet. We're advancing the conversation. We're evolving our conversation. It would require about $140 million average annual. So that's an additional $80 million per year. It doesn't mean in the first year we could spend 140 necessarily, because we know we need to do some feasibility studies. There's some preliminary engineering sorts of things. But in any program, you would sort of see like that bell-shaped curve where you would build up, and at the peak, you might spend more than 140 million, but it's average annual over the life of a 10-year program. It includes administration and operations costs are also embedded in those figures. Okay, next slide. So this Local Consult scenario 2, and it's included in the handout that Matt provided yesterday, would have these levels of investment across our priority areas: 18 in aquifer, 56 in reservoir, 43 in water quality, with 6 million each year in research and education. And then we see the 2302 money at 5 million and 12 million for tech assistance and for community grants. That totals the 140 million. Okay, next slide. So, and you've got your handout, that kind of outlines what those outcomes look like. So at Local Consult, what we would be doing is saying, like, so Do these proposed investment levels and outcomes seem reasonable to you? And like what might be missing? Dawn, if it's okay with you, I think I'd like to just keep going through so we make sure we get through the materials and then we come back to these questions if that's okay with you. Okay, because I think we'll just keep getting more context as we go. So these are the top level outcomes. And I want to emphasize, this is not like everything that's embedded in the scenarios. It's everything we're currently doing and this as well. So at the aquifer level, 18 million per year, we would do tech upgrades, 50 to 75% of irrigation systems in Kansas, which would allow us to save 15% or more in water use while remaining profitable. Grants so that at least 30 communities could purchase water rights. Reservoirs, 100% in reservoir sediment managed at these reservoirs listed. And then evaluate and where it makes sense, if it makes sense, secure water supply for up to 350,000 people through regional interconnection projects. And then on the water quality side, ensuring that 99% of all drinking water systems in Kansas meet federal standards, 95% meet wastewater discharge, and 35% of orphan contaminated sites are closed and remediated. So we're going to have to circle back with folks and say, like, A, do those seem like reasonable and good outcomes? Is that what you would be looking for? And then we have to talk about the price point, which is 140 million per year average annual. Next slide. In addition to, I think, really those nuts and bolts questions that I just asked, it's also, these become sort of those policy and goal statements. Like, is it reasonable for Kansas communities for an outcome to be that people will have 50 years or more water supply for their communities and their economies in the next 10 years? Do we want to, if a community is seeking grants or loans, do we want to require that they connect to the water system to another water system in the region, or that the resiliency of their water supply is available? Do we want to, for example, this bullet on, do we want to require a long-term water supply planning? And these are hard questions in some cases to answer because the state has a return on investment to consider as well. And do we want to invest dollars in a community if they don't know where even what the condition of their water supply or source is over the next few years? Or if they needed to pipe in some water, do they have the ability to even be able to procure that kind of system? These are the kinds of questions that we want to discuss as we think about how we might refine some of our programs. And would we want to require cost share programs where we're going to provide funding for irrigation that they be in an adopted LEMA, WCA, or Aguca system? So we're going to have all those conversations as part of local consult. I'm keeping an eye on time. I know I'm flying through it. We'll have 3 hours at local consult. I only have you for an hour and a half, so I'm trying to balance here. This is an example of a policy question. So, and I think it comes maybe from Nebraska, but as it relates to our sedimentation and buffer strip programs, on the like we're not getting as much money. If we were to provide funds for the buffer strip on the left, you can see there's still a lot of sedimentation that's occurring then from the right side. And so can we justify taxpayers paying for only half of the stream? Next slide. Or do we want to try to encourage through incentive or regulation or just selection that something be implemented on the right side as well? So next slide. So is it reasonable? The real question is the most important part of this example is to say, is it reasonable that all programs be evaluated every 2 years based on their ability to make progress on our goals? And then we share sort of that scorecard of the programs at local consult. And if programs are underperforming, now, right, and we don't implement this all at once because we don't know how to evaluate all of our programs. But once we are in that flow, so to speak, programs that are underperforming would be required to be revamped or discontinued based on stakeholder input and agency expertise. So this example is to show maybe we're not getting as much out of our buffer strip program as we think we should. We'd talk to Kansans about it, the agencies would weigh in, and maybe we would establish a threshold that at least, pick a number, 16% of all landowners have to opt in order for us to hit the effectiveness we think we ought to see. Or maybe we'd say, let's increase those incentives, but only have the sedimentation programs near our highest risk reservoirs. So that's how this sort of, is it reasonable to have this sort of evaluation process associated with our programs so that we can both evaluate and then fine tune based on input changes in our programs. Okay, next slide. And then the third part is where we get to the money. And, you know, as much as we might like the outcomes, we have to talk about how could we fund it. I want to point out before we go to the money part that the first two parts, the criteria and the reasonableness, those don't necessarily cost anything. What those do is those refocus and organize the way that we think about programs, we evaluate, we make decisions. It's a change maybe in the way we operate that can be done with more money. Yes, easier maybe, but it doesn't mean that those first two things can't or shouldn't happen, right? These are things that can begin without necessarily additional funds. Now on the revenue side, if we want more outcomes, we have to pay for those more outcomes. And so next slide. So we're at 60 million now, average annual. We said we would like to get to 140 million if you want the outcomes that have been demonstrated. So that means there's this $80 million funding gap per year. And so we are going to talk about both fees as well as considering some new sources of revenue or financing. And we outline those in the handout. We know user fees are the only currently dedicated source, and they raise about 13 million. If we were to double fees, that would get us to 26 million. So it means 26 million is still not enough to close that gap. So we're going to have to talk about new sources of revenue or financing. Next slide. And so on the handout, there are pros and cons associated with user fees, the Economic Development Transfer Fund, and state general funds. There are potential new sources for us to talk about. Bonding, for example. In transportation, we bond for those big projects that last and provide benefits for multiple generations, right? So you're not going to go bond, I think it's in the handout, you're not going to bond to go to the grocery store, but you might use bonding if you want to purchase a home. You're going to pay for your home over years, and you're going to live in your home for years. So there's a benefit that exceeds 1 or 2 years. Normally you would want the benefits to last longer than the terms of the bond. We'll talk about an ag irrigation use fee and how you might consider that use. We want to recognize quickly that GMDs assess a fee for local benefits. There isn't a statewide ag use fee. There are many sorts of ways that could be implemented. There's general tax in terms of both sales tax or severance tax. And there might be other ideas for sources. In our breakout groups, we will ask folks, what do you like and dislike? But just as importantly, like why? Again, we're going for that. What can we learn about people's thought process related to the sources so that as we develop recommendations, we're taking those thoughts into consideration as much as and building recommendations that make sense within the broader framework. Okay, next slide. And so this is an example, not a recommendation, but it's a way that we could, maybe get to 140 million if you were to look at bonding at 30 and sales tax at 20. So this is just a way to show, and bonding would be backed probably by general fund fees or general fund dollars. But this is an example of how you might build a budget. And we'll ask folks, like, what would you think would make sense in a budget? And this is where the back and forth starts to come into play, because people might be like, ooh, boy, I wouldn't want to, okay, now that I think of it that way, maybe 140, maybe I'm more interested in something that looks like 100 million. Or maybe somebody says 140 sounds great to me, and let's do it all in X or Y sorts of increases. So it's the conversation that is really the value of local consult. Okay, next slide. And then we've got handouts to help with the conversation. We've got profiles so that each region can understand kind of the water usage in their region as contrasted to statewide. And then, as you know, you've got this this lengthy, I mean, I feel like it's really short in terms of all of the material that could be in there, but it's still at 5 pages that gives you information about sources and funds of revenue. And with that, oh, and then this is how we will help people understand how to get to their breakout group. Next slide. And then the main session wrap up. So, and that's the map conversation. So I think let's pause here. We're at 12:36. Let's have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A on that. Then we'll go to the maps. And then I want to reserve at least a half hour for bracketology. So Dawn, I'm handing it back to you to moderate the Q&A session, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions I can.
Great. Thank you so much, Julie. We really appreciate the detailed overview. So let's kick it off and get started, and feel free to use the hand raise button as well if there's lots of conversation. So does anyone want to kick us off with questions?
This is Carolyn. I wanted to say the hand raise isn't working for me, and it said something about anyway. It's not clicking, but so I'll just text you, Dawn, if I have to do that again. So go ahead and continue. I have a question, but I need to formulate it a little better.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. And your hand raise is up right now, so it is working.
Okay.
They're a little finicky. I've had the pops up and down. John Bailey, do you want to start?
I can. I would like to ask for some definition, I guess, clarity for my purposes. We talk about conserve the aquifers. Can we, in another word for that, because they do have two different connotations, could we talk about stabilize? Is stabilizing and conserve the same in your mind, or are they two different things?
From my perspective, you have to conserve to get to stabilization.
When does stabilization come into play then, Julie?
Say again?
When does stabilization come into play then?
I would bounce that over to, is Lane on the call? Or Josh? I assume this is related to aquifers?
Yes.
Josh, are you available? I don't see Lane. Matt?
Sorry, I had to step away. I'm back.
There you are. Thanks, Josh.
What was the question? Sorry.
My question was, can we consider stabilization equivalent to conserve? In other words, can we stop the depletion of the aquifer?
I mean, I think that's going to have to take some additional conversations with some of the GMDs in the region. And we know we're working on that currently with regard to HB 2279 and other issues that have come up. So that's part of the conversation.
Well, I think we have the tools, and can certainly develop them to monitor groundwater tables in the Ogallala and administer as appropriate. So we could stabilize it if we chose to do that. It would be a little bit more draconian than voluntary compliance, but I'm not totally convinced that voluntary compliance is going to get us where we need to be.
Thank you, John. Appreciate your feedback. And all right, so let me go to the next one. Alan Rose?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
I agree with John on the stabilization, but I guess concern I have or question I have in my mind is how do you monitor and keep the stabilization at a level you set and make sure it stays there year after year after year?
So although, Don, I don't have a specific technical answer to that. I think when we get to the maps and the eventual dashboard, Alan, I think that will be helpful input for you.
Thank you, Julie. Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Mike Armstrong?
Yes, my question is, where did the $140 million come from? Can you kind of give us more detail on what's included in that figure?
Sure. Aim, could you go back to that slide? And Mike, I'd be quick to point out, like there's a difference between a budget view, like the budget committee for the Water Authority has, and what we share at Local Consult, right? At Local Consult, it's a broad stakeholder group. So this is what we would be showing at Local Consult. We certainly have when we get to the budget committee, this is certainly broken down. And, we showed you the decoder where we show all of the math associated with it. But this is the investment that gets you to 140 that would be shown at Local Consult.
Yeah, my question is more on the expenditure side. How would this money be spent?
So if you go to the handout, if you look in the right column, that shows you how much, and remember, this is on average per year over 10 years. And that gives you sort of like the high level categories. And then on the right side, the outcomes for those categories.
It seems like at some point we need to do some kind of an engineering analysis, some kind of a detailed plan. Does that $140 million cover the cost of doing that kind of an ongoing engineering analysis?
Engineering analysis associated with?
What kind of projects to do, how much they're going to cost, how to prioritize different projects.
Right around the corner boardroom.
Oh, Alan, you might want to mute yourself, unless you've got a question. Thank you. So, Mike, that's part of putting together a 10-year program, right? It's like you set up the framework, which is what we're working on now. We continue to monitor it every 2 years. We make adjustments. There are certainly, without question, there are engineering analysis things that happen within these buckets, and then the agencies. That's why we're working so hard, honestly, is to figure out how to evolve from sort of programmatic expenditures, individual programs, into a broader view of problem solving with dollars invested towards each of those problems. So I think what you're asking is, we have started on that path now.
Right. It just seems like at some point we need to make the investment to come up with a more specific project list. And that's going to require some investment. So, you have that one slide that talked about existing commitments that have to come off the top. It seems like we need to have some provision in our plans to invest in that engineering analysis to create a master plan, like a big picture strategy map.
Sure. So I think
we know what needs to be done.
Well, so I would use the transportation analogy, right, where we have different systems within preservation to identify preservation projects, priority formula. On the expansion projects, we use different criteria, which is part of the conversation we're having today, to identify those. We have a development pipeline, right? We put projects in to develop those, and then we pull those projects out based on the amount of money we have to move to construction. So these are all various. There is not one engineering formula that could do all of those various things. And that's why this has been so complicated, because we have 3 agencies that have had 3 different views of doing their work. And now we're building the superstructure to start to align programs to solve problems. Will we need a priority formula for water, so to speak? Maybe. We don't know that quite yet today. We're still getting ourselves organized. I would also suggest, and I'm not at all trying to avoid the question, because I would love to sit down and talk you through how that evolves over 10 years. Remember, we're sort of like at the CHP of life, this comprehensive highway plan. We're not at the T-Works plan or the IKE plan. We're building it. We're working on it. There are very likely systems that will need to be developed and purchased to support a new view of the way water will work in Kansas. That's very likely. I would also suggest and I'm again happy to meet with you and sit down and talk through like how that could work. This is not a conversation that we're going to have at local consult. It would not be, it would be you pick either way too over people's heads or like too in the weeds. I could, whatever analogy you want to use. But this kind of conversation, we're not going to have at local consult because nobody'd follow it very well.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think it's a conversation to be discussed at a local consult level, but somewhere in the background, there needs to be a more specific plan with detailed cost estimates and
I think you'll see those in some of those buckets, but I don't know that you're going to get a detailed cost estimate across each and every one of these programs that align because they're just disparate programs in some cases.
No, what I'm saying is it's going to take an investment to get that information.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, totally.
So do we have something? I feel like we need to have an earmark or some kind of a commitment to take care of that component.
I hear you. I don't even know what I think we need to figure out what that even sort of looks like. And then that needs to be included. I don't think we need it for next year yet. Maybe. I mean, we might need some more engineering support to get us to right. If you're thinking of sort of that almost like help to develop the RFP, if that's sort of, I think we might be saying sort of the same thing. We might not even know how to write the RFP quite yet. We might need to secure help to write the RFP.
Okay, we can talk about that later.
Okay, cool.
The other thing I was going to mention is that I really like the way the different geographic areas had profiles, because I think that gives a good context as to, what the investments, maybe what the return on investment would be. One idea that I had, I was thinking if in addition to the statistics that you have on those profiles, to include maybe the tax revenues and then also the fee revenues from those different areas, because I think that would also be beneficial to kind of see what the source of the revenues are.
Yeah, I hear you. I think that's a conversation we'll need to have. A, can we gather it, and B, can we gather it before next Tuesday? And that might be subsequent. And anyway, that's something that the jail need to weigh in on.
But I really did like these profiles. I think that made a lot of sense.
Yeah, shout out to Amy put those together. They're pretty cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Senator McGinn, you're ready to go?
Yeah, thank you, Dawn. Just a few things. One's a question for Julie on the evaluation of every 2 years process. That's just an example. Is that correct? Because the reason I bring that up, I know we did that with the transportation plan, and that seems to work because we know we've been doing that for 40 years now. But I think when you're doing buffer strips and things like that have to grow, and different types of materials that have to be put in place. My suggestion would be like 3 years or something like that, but I don't know that today's the day to fix that stuff. But and then back to John's comment about the aquifer conservation. I think that is something that we should look at, but we have to treat every aquifer different because the Equus Bez actually does recharge. And then we have different players that participate in that aquifer. And then as we know, the Ocala has very little recharge capability. But I think that'd be a great thing to take a look at. And then kind of want to just get back to, I may have shared this before, so I apologize if I'm repeating myself, but I did chair the task force on transportation, and that was a 2-year process. And then the second year, it was very unusual that a budget chair would get to help draft that bill. Generally, it's transportation, but leadership pitched it in my lap. And so I learned quite a bit about how we put together our 10-year plans. And so I keep hearing Mike talk about specific projects, and when it comes to transportation, it certainly is not a good idea, because then everything becomes kind of political. But what we did is we had X% of dollars will go towards maintenance and preservation. X% of dollars will go to new construction and even rail. We have rail, we have airlines, we have everything. But we don't get into, in a bill, we do not get into, I'm going to build an airport at Newton, Kansas, or anything like that. I know transportation is a little bit different than the water, because that department has been geared up with engineers for a number of years. And so they can do a lot more in-depth studies and look at where some of the improvements need to be made across the state in those areas, and population trends and things like that. So I wouldn't want to get into those projects, because I also do believe we're a legislature as well. And what we're doing right now, we're guided by, the legislature and the governor's office. And so they are going to be the ones that now I get to make a phone call to. But if I have a project I feel strongly about, I'm going to be calling like my representatives and other people that I know that are in the legislature, because those will be the ones that encourage the agencies as they come before them in their budget work, to guide them. For that is the input. And then from there, the water office would have to explore, or the Department of Ag and that type of thing. So I thought this overall is a pretty good presentation. It's just that I just don't want us to get hung up in projects and dollars, because I will tell you that when we get done with this and we put a pretty bow on it and we hand it to the governor's office, she may make some changes, but then when she hands it to the legislature, they're going to make changes. And so these are our recommendations, because maybe we're a little closer to water than they are, but it's an opportunity for them to scrutinize what we think is best for Kansas. So thank you, Don.
Senator, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It's really valuable to have you, and also to have your leadership on this. I appreciate it. I'm learning as we go along, so thank you. Jean Steiner, you're up next.
Thank you. And I want to talk about a point that's on slide number 30, and this is it reasonable? And the bottom bullet, I think, is going to raise some confusion in several of the regions around the state, because some of those programs that are mentioned, the LEMA can only be, you have to be in a groundwater management district in order to even have a LEMA. WCA has criteria that are all about depletion, I think, of water before you can have a WCA. I'm not sure if it links to water quality, but my point is that this is very much a Western Kansas criteria, but there's aquifer issues all over the state. Many of them are water quality as much as or more than water quantity. And I think we need to make sure that our irrigation conservation programs address across the different characteristics of different aquifers in different parts of the state. So I know this is only an example, but if you pull this slide up and ask people to discuss it in, southeastern Kansas or northeastern Kansas, or maybe in the center where there's less irrigation at all, then they won't know what to do with it, I don't think. So maybe it could be rephrased in a way that makes more sense for a statewide discussion.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jean. We'll figure something out, whether we just take it out or change it.
I like having that discussion, but it's not really equally relevant across the entire state. but I think within the areas that it's relevant, then it's a very important discussion to have.
Good point. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Pete, you're up next.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, so appreciate the materials. It's definitely, feels like we're getting this, narrowed in to, better, more specific actions, more specific targets on everything we're doing. There was one target that really caught my attention when we went by. It was the 99% drinking water to the federal standards, which sounds, it sounds awful. What that means 1% doesn't have clean drinking water to a federal standard. So maybe there's something I'm missing in the criteria around the definition around drinking water. But that to me seems like a very low bar. And I'm just an airplane guy thinking 99% sometimes is just a terrible number. So
all right. I think let's bounce that over to Tom Stiles to respond to, or someone else from ADHE, because
okay, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, so Pete, right now, about 91% of the community systems comply with all health-based standards. Others are battling nitrate, arsenic, disinfection byproducts, and so forth. A lot of this stems from aging infrastructure. So to get us to 99% of the systems to be fully compliant, basically pulls for an investment in infrastructure to replace that and to build up their treatment capability in a cost-effective manner. It's 99% because we're never 100%. There's always an operational upset or something that happens that there'll be an occasional violation or deviation from the health-based federal standards. The goal one is to minimize the number of systems that encounter that, and when they do encounter it, to make the duration of that violation be very short, that they get quickly returned to compliance and so forth. But you can't, in this world, I don't think you can bat 1,000. I think 99% is pretty aspirational if we can get it. But the real driver for it was it's going to take money for infrastructure for us to get there, especially infrastructure help for the smaller systems. Basically, put it in place, maintain it, and maintain an operating workforce that knows how to run the equipment. So
okay. Hey, and Tom, not to chew up all of our time, but so then we've got that criteria to the federal standard. Is there anything in that remaining things that are between that 91% that we're at today and the 100 that gives us another reasonable measure that, okay, it's not to this standard, but it's drinkable? To a layman, it just seems like, it just sounds like, 1% we're poisoning, and I know that's not the case.
Yeah. Oh, but the 91%, the percentage isn't the number of systems. If you want to talk population, the number is way better. It's 97% of the citizens in Kansas that are served by public water supply have got water that meets all health-based standards there. So you've got 3% that encounter a disinfection byproduct violation or nitrate and so forth.
Okay.
So again, the number of systems reflects the smaller communities.
Gotcha.
The population reflects that certainly the larger systems are always compliant on all that. So we can build it out into a broader picture to give a real sense of it, but it's essentially small town compliance that drives what you're seeing there.
Okay.
So,
all right. Hey,
I'm
thank you
gonna-
for the clarification.
Thank you. I'm going to hop in since we're at close to 1. I'd like to ask your indulgence that we go ahead and cover the map part, because that's generated some conversation, and then we go to the criterion, and if folks I appreciate your feedback. It's always helpful if somebody wants to like email Matt and he can share it with the rest of us or whatever. I'm not trying to cut off conversation, but I think we probably need to scoot along if that's okay, Dawn.
Yeah, I just want to make sure Randy, Jeremiah, Alan Sotart, and David Stroberg, if you have any questions on this part of it, maybe put it in the chat and we'll see if we can't grab any at the end if you had any. Thanks,
Okay.
Julie.
All right. Okay. So folks will have gone to their breakouts when they come back. I want to point out as when everyone comes back that like we heard that you want programs to be streamlined and more efficient, and you want a universal like one-stop shop for information, and that we should increase awareness about water supply challenges. And I want to preview to you today something that we'll be taking out. Next slide. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. So we shared this at local consult, and I'm like, well, I like this heat map, but it'd be much more impactful if I'm in that red to brown area, like, I don't know, like maybe I don't have as big a problem as I think. So next slide, we showed this at the ag webinar, and you can see what we did is we said, okay, let's be more specific. And Geologic Survey provided us with some good data. And we said, all right, we identified specific towns that if they pumped at the rate that they currently are, that they within the next 25 years would likely run out of that water from that well at that rate. That doesn't mean they don't have water. It means they might be able to pump in water from another location, find another well, condemn water rights in nearby communities. But all of that takes additional action and additional cost. And then for those that are in gold, those dots represent maybe within the next 50 years. And whoa, the phone started ringing and some folks were like, hey, like that's not right. We've got data that shows we've got more supply. We also had many communities that called and said, we ought to be on that map. We're concerned. And we had more communities that called and said, thank you. This is like a great heads up. It's also a tool to collaborate with those folks in your communities in terms of conservation, with those that are around you in terms of ag practices, and also with the state as we think about implementing incentive programs, and also as we think about how we might want to set criteria. So next slide. What this really reminds me of, the reaction to the map was very much back under T-Works when it was time to go look for $8 billion and the legislature was like, that's a lot of money. We would like to know what's the economic impact of some of these investments. And I was there at the time. We were kind of like, well, we don't really know. And they were like, and the legislature said, well, like figure it out. So we hired a transportation economist. We set up this task force working group. Actually, Mary Birch chaired it. She was Overland Park Chamber of Commerce at the time, but we had urban and rural interests that were on that committee. It took us about 9 months to figure out. We made some really good policy decisions, like we would never have rural and urban projects compete on economic impact. We would separate them, use similar methodology, but they would never compete head to head. And we reached out and we were like, hey, and Gary, you might have been at Wichita at the time, but we said, hey, communities, bring us your data. And Wichita's like, yeah, we think you don't have quite all the right data. We adjusted some of our data sets, not all of them. In the Southwest community, they said, like your radius, your 10-mile radius, in terms of impact isn't right. This project would impact a 100-mile radius. We're like, okay, good point. So we took that. The point is that it took us a while to develop this evaluation criteria, but it was such a good collaboration tool. That was in 2010, coming out of the recession. Fast forward to 2020 under Ike, and we changed, instead of looking at jobs created, now you'll remember in 2020, we were all about like supply chain delay. So we changed our metric from jobs to travel time, recognizing the importance of moving both product and that we don't want people sitting in traffic so long trying to get to jobs. This is where we are sort of, I think, in water in terms of creating these maps that show different levels of remaining water or whatever has been, whatever we want to make the particular metric. We can get there through good conversation. We're having good impact and conversation with stakeholders because it will become a tool. So next slide. after that. So these are good examples. I wish Earl was here with us today because he can tell you the kinds of things that are happening in terms of when we went out and we talked. So I'm kind of glancing at my notes because it's still past the time. Like Sublette has drilled multiple test wells and they are producing at a really low rate, enough to support not enough to support completing a well for public water supply. So they're going to have to purchase existing water rights and convert it to a municipal use. And they've been unsuccessful in finding a water right that's available. Then Leota, for example, they have a 20-foot saturated thickness and their best well 6 miles north of town. And they just purchased an irrigation water right to convert it. And that right is for small irrigation. It's okay for municipal use. So these are examples of activities that these communities are taking to try to build out their water supply. Imagine starting to have those kinds of conversations with all those communities that have the red and gold dots. They can learn from each other, they can partner with the state, but it helps illuminate the problems that we are trying to solve. And long-term, the investments that we make can start to target to help get these communities off these maps. Because the water is valuable for what it does. It allows us to live and to have economies. Okay, next slide. And then on the east side, right, because everybody's got a water problem. It just varies depending on where you are. So this is a good example, and we need to continue to work on this. This is a map that shows, based on a historical drought record from the 50s, that if we were to have a drought like that again, where we would have some problems in our state, and then we start to take a look at how you could address where we have communities that are at risk, but it's a different metric, right? On the west side, it's how much water supply you have in more of a, because it's a chronic condition, it's ongoing. On the east side, this would be a drought condition, severe drought on the east side. So for example, Independence, they get water from the Elk City Reservoir, and that's filling in at a rate that shows Indy is drought vulnerable in less than 50 years based on the model comparing it to the 1950s drought. So again, we start to help people understand where they need to be looking for backup supplies. I also think there's nothing better about this map than to underscore why conservation is important no matter where you live in the state. So next slide, please, Aim. What we want to get to with this kind of information is maybe every 2 years be able to update those community conditions so it becomes a dashboard. So people can understand what's going on in my community and am I moving that needle to the better or not. We recognize sometimes aquifers recharge, so that would, it's not a static thing at all. What conservation measures are my irrigators taking that are helping, that communities are taking? Have we had much rain? The USGS actually provides a water dashboard. This just happens to be their example, but long-term, this becomes a conversation and a management tool, and it can help shape investment, and we can monitor our outcomes. So it's all about the water and what it's doing for Kansans. It's a new way to communicate about water. It isn't perfect. It's a work in progress, but I want everybody to know that this dashboard can provide multiple benefits. We're just not there yet, but we're working on it. So Dawn, I'm going to take a breather there, and we're going to get ready for the criteria conversation. If anybody has any questions so far. Oh yeah, and we're talking with the Corps of Engineers, yes.
Any follow-up questions before Julie moves on?
All right.
Let's keep going.
Now it's like March Madness, kind of, or, like analogy anyway. Okay, so Amy, if you want to pull up the next piece. So we're going to move on to bracketology. Okay, and remember you've got your handout with thought starters in terms of definitions and potential metrics, how we might measure this criteria. And so this is the bracket we've built out based on the feedback for all of you who filled out a survey. This is how we were able to build it out. So you can see like human health, it got a good seed, so it's further in. It's like closer to the final four, as did cost effectiveness, resiliency, and stakeholder input. Those were sort of the big four. So they get a bye in the first round. Okay. So I think we start with the, I'm right in, thank you, Amy. We have room for for 2 additional criteria to be written in, and I think we're going to talk now, Amy, about that, right? A reminder that, right, that these are already baked into the pie, so to speak, in terms of compliance. We got to pay our bills, and these projects or this criteria, like whatever we're evaluating, has to serve our guiding principles. Next slide. Okay, I want to highlight a couple of things that we garnered both from our conversations with the governor and with water authority members. So in your handout, but did not make it into the bracket, it's population impacted, regional partnerships, local contribution, that would be communities that would be putting some skin into the game, public-private partnerships, limited assistance elsewhere, and then an ability to leverage federal funds. Want to highlight the regional partnership and impact criteria. The governor has been pretty clear as programs have been developed that it's important for communities to be thinking in a regional way. So although that wasn't prioritized by the water authority members, I would highlight that it's been something that's been pretty important to her administration and has been something that folks have been paying attention to as programs have been developed. Water authority members also suggested working to combine maybe some criteria so that we would gain security of supply for dependable resources, so a long-term supply vision, projects and programs that represent the best long-term solution so that we have more sustainability for the future, and that we also consider holistic watershed health. So we're going to be able to choose 2 write-in criteria to put into the bracket. So these are some things you might want to consider when we get to the write-in portion. Okay. Okay. So maybe we've got what, about 15 minutes. Maybe we could just do one version to show like how it would work, and then we'll just talk about the criteria in general. So Amy, if you want to go to the next slide.
Well, are we going to add write-ins? We need to know that.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if we do that on the slide. We do it from this slide. Thank you.
Yeah, well, we can add it into the bracket either way. Just
okay. Yeah, maybe go back. You're right. It'd be easier if people can see it. And so if you were to choose 2 to add to the bracket, what would be the 2 you'd want to take? You'd want to move forward with?
Julie, are we going to answer this via a survey, or are you
No,
asking us
I think
to
this is just conversation.
conversation?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So do you all want to weigh in? You can write it in the chat too. If you have Jean Steiner, we'll start with you. And you can write it in the chat also.
Okay, I could have gone to chat, but the groups I was in at local consults on the first round really talked a lot about watershed health, so I would consider that one. And then I personally I think the bolded one over there of regional partnerships is something that I very much think is important to success, so I might include those 2.
Okay.
Thank you, Jean. Amy, could you stop? I don't know if it's possible. No, if you stop the share, then they can't see it. Never mind. It's just easier to track them. Anyone else? Senator McGinn says regional partnerships.
Yeah. Okay.
Anyone else want to weigh in? I would also put a vote for regional partnership and watershed health. John Bailey, water supply security, also involving rural water districts. So water supply security. Okay. Anyone else? I think they're going to the chat here. Populations impacted and long-term solutions. Regional partnership impact. So regional partnership is getting several votes. Regional partnership and water supply security. Okay.
No.
Anyone else? Randy?
Yeah, this is Randy.
Yes.
I'm on an iPad, so I'm not typing, but I'd say population impacted and local contribution.
Great, thank you, Randy. Okay, anyone else? Jay said in the comments, just to note, water supply security is included in the definition of resiliency, which is already a criteria. Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Dawn.
Yes, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I understand that. So the ones that are not bolded on the left side, they're out unless we put them in. Are they out unless we put them in?
So we will take all, so what we're doing, Don, okay, if I go ahead and kind of.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so what we'll do is we're going to take a seeded bracket to local consult, but there will be blanks for write-in. So it's possible that that all 4 breakout groups could have slightly different results because we're going to have some blanks for write-in. So they're going to see from the handout, they're going to see all the options. So the answer is they're not out. They're still on the list. They're just not in.
Okay. So my question is, people were just disinterested in local contribution?
Yeah, they just didn't, not very many people selected that to go into a bracket.
And we should be clear, she's talking about the water authority's responses, did not choose, local contribution didn't rise to the top.
Okay. Okay.
Also, if you'll recall, I would be quick to say that we are looking for, out of this whole process, 1 or 2 things that would be sort of like, that we would try to get to be consistent across most things, most program selections or project selections. We might decide to create, like the cost share program, we might decide that local contribution is really important, even if it's never prioritized through the local consult process. Remember, if you remember those like pie charts of the various programs, we might have criteria for one program that isn't in another program. So these are not necessarily out. They just are not going to make it to the bracket, or they might not be discussed at local consult, but the agencies will still take a look at criteria that makes sense for their program. We're trying to find a couple of themes that would help inform most project selection.
Thank you, Julie. Amy, have you been keeping a tally? I lost count. Senator,
Sorry,
would
I was
you
on
like
mute.
to?
Yeah,
sure.
regional partnership definitely has a lot. And I would think maybe population impacted, because now we've covered that the water supply issue is already embedded in resiliency.
Okay, thank you. Senator, do you want to throw out 2 as well?
Throw out or put in?
Put in, sorry.
That's all right.
Meaning say.
I mean, I don't know if we're, like you said, you asked Amy if we're counting, but the local contribution, I'd like, if that needs another vote, I'd like to give it one. And there's lots of reasons why. One is just, I think communities will take better care of things if they're part of the process of the funding and that kind of thing. And then just one little example is just, communities love to build these little lakes and ponds. And then when there's problems, they come to the state to fix them. And so I think people are more apt to help take care of it together if we partner.
Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in? All right, Julie, back to you.
All right. Well, you know, I'm starting to see why we have a 3-hour local consult meeting. That's what I'd say. So maybe we could demonstrate, Amy, one example of how, right. So the way it would work in local consult, we'd say, all right, so there are 2 criteria here. Demographics, we ought to consider, like, you know, is this an underserved community? Is it an impoverished community? That sort of thing. Is that more important to consider, or is it important to consider that you might be addressing 2 or 3 of the problems? So maybe this is a project that would help both water quality and reservoirs. So is it more important to consider vulnerable populations, or is it more important to consider that you're going to be able to address more than one problem? And then, so I would ask the water authority, if you had 2 projects and they cost the same, but one gets you more for impoverished communities and the other helps you make advanced progress on more than one problem, which would you choose? And you have limited money. Like, it's all the thing. It's like real world. Like, you want to do both, but you only get to pick one of these 2. Which would you? And when in local consult, I'd say, or right now, who would want to say one or the other? Who would want to make a statement on behalf of one or the other? Okay, why would anybody think that it would be a better buy with taxpayer dollars to invest in a project that helps solve or make progress on 2 problems or 3? Why is that important?
Hey, Julie, this is Alan Sudharts. I'll just comment on that. I picked the guiding principles because, again, if we can make the impact on multiple projects, again, that's how I would spend my dollars only. So
Thanks,
I can
Al.
give you that. Yeah.
Would anyone want to think about community demographics? Like, why would you want to think about maybe a town that has low health outcomes?
Anyone want to speak to that one?
No, I'll just weigh in. I mean, I'm saying guiding principles as well. I think the guiding principles are all encompassing, and so it's just a broader answer.
Okay, let's vote. As an example, let's vote. See what comes out. Okay, so we get to guiding principles, and then if we could quickly go to the big bracket, and Isaac will show us what it looks like.
So guiding principles
wins
on Isaac, so you can advance that, but we have this set up to go to the next.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Or we can go to the bracket view if you prefer, Julie.
Let's go to the bracket view. We'll go to the bracket view.
So we have guiding principles.
Yeah, right. So from the 2, guiding principles would now be compared to human health, right? And then that's how that continues to work its way through. And you see the highlighted regional partnerships and population impacted, because those were the 2 that this group thought should be written in. So and then I want us to move on to next steps because we need to cover that. But here's my observation of this. A, glad we're going to have 3 hours. B, let's simplify, and we're just going to go to an 18 bracket. We're not going to have as many options. We're just going to have to narrow in because it's going to take too long. Okay, let's take a question from Jean as we get to next steps, and then we'll go on to next steps. Jean?
No, I really don't have a question anymore. I think we've moved on from what I was going to say.
Okay, all right, thank you. Next, also, we'll do next steps, and I've got one concluding comment.
Julie, did you ask me a question? I'm sorry. No. Okay, you're moving on to next steps. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank
All
you.
right. So in terms of next steps, we'll be out next week. I would encourage everyone, please reach out to your colleagues in your constituencies to encourage them to attend local consult. I'm thinking about all this, and we may need to still streamline the opening because I think these conversations are going to be difficult and rich. And so we need to probably try to simplify even more. In terms of next steps, and Matt may want to weigh in here in just a minute, but we absolutely want to make sure we're getting connected with RAC so that they have a chance to provide input. And I think the The regional planners will be scheduling input opportunities for that round 2, and they'll likely be virtual meetings due to schedule constraints. And then we'll be back. We'll be summarizing just as fast as we can. Our last meeting is October 1st, and then we're back with the Water Authority to provide you with summary. So there's just a lot going on, but thank you all. It's super helpful to get to practice and to hear your questions, and your attention is just phenomenal. So thank you for all that you're doing, because there's a lot. And so Dawn, I don't know if you want to wrap us up, or if Matt, you have anything left to add related to kind of outreach with the recs.
Thank you, Julie. Matt, do you want to give some input?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. This is Matt Under from the Kansas Water Office. And just to build on what Julie touched on there, one of the things that we're working through right now with our regional planning and outreach coordinators is trying to find some form of touch point with all 14 of the regional advisory committees between now and kind of that early October timeframe. So as you see on the slide here, the regional planners are planning on reaching out to RACs to work on scheduling those touch points with each of the RACs during this round 2 stakeholder input phase that we're working on in conjunction with ongoing local consults. So stay tuned for more information on that, but those meetings in whatever form, whether they're virtual or otherwise, they'll be looking to get scheduled here in the coming days. So that information should be at least available as far as calendar invites within the next week or so.
Thank you, Matt. There's a note in the chat from Vijay where he says, everyone feel free to send an email via the Kansas Water Office with any additional questions or feedback if we did not have time today as you review the materials. And then I would just like to say thank you all for attending this meeting today. This is hard work. There's a lot here, but it's really, really important. So thank you to Julie and your team, and thank you to the agencies for providing us with such important materials today to consider and provide feedback. So we look forward to seeing you all at local consult next week.